We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 3rd of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, peace talks stall with Ukraine and Russia still firmly at odds over a ceasefire. We'll explore the purpose of the discussions and ask what happens next with our correspondent in Istanbul. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes.
This is the task of our time, to make the United Nations fit for purpose, fit for the future.
Germany's former foreign minister becomes the president of the UN General Assembly. I'll be joined in the studio by our senior news editor Chris Chermak for more. Plus,
one of the strengths here is the military-civilian relationship. It's strong. You don't see that on a lot of conflicts. Very often you start seeing tension between those two groups.
Canada's ambassador to Ukraine explores the importance of finding peacefulness in times of conflict. We'll go through the newspapers, and our Tokyo bureau chief will join us to tell us more about how a new law in Japan will protect workers from the heat. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The UN Human Rights Chief has denounced the new US and Israeli-run aid delivery system in southern Gaza, saying it's heartbreaking. All the administrative staff at the Chiquito banana plant in Panama have left the country, and the firm is to sack the remaining staff. And Mexico's president has defended this weekend's vote to elect the country's judiciary, saying it was a complete success despite a turnout of just 13%. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, discussions in Istanbul have stalled as Russia and Ukraine failed to make progress in the second round of peace talks yesterday. Some concessions were made, principally of a humanitarian kind. There will be exchanges of prisoners of war and the handing over of the bodies of dead soldiers. But there is next to nothing on the issue of a ceasefire. Well, I'm joined now from Istanbul by Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent. And you've been down at the scene, haven't you, Ruth? Good morning. What was it like when you went down there?
Well, these talks were held in a very grand former Ottoman palace, the Tiran Palace, which is now a 5-star hotel. So the setup was a little bit different to the talks that took place here between exactly the same set of negotiators, much to the irritation of the Ukrainian side. Those talks that happened a couple of weeks ago were at a different Ottoman palace that is normally has more of a use for kind of diplomatic events. This time, the sense that we got when the Ukrainians spoke quite extensively afterwards was that the atmosphere in the room, despite this somewhat grander setting, that didn't necessarily do much to propel the talks forward. Lots of clash over and potentially bad feeling in the room over the Ukrainian demand that Russia hand over a memo outlining Moscow's vision for a ceasefire before the talks started. And the Russian negotiators apparently waited until they got into the room to hand over this document. And so the Ukrainians essentially said, well, we can't really make progress here today on this most substantive issue because we haven't seen this document until we got here. And so we wanted to be able to do preparation to use this time to really make progress by looking at your proposal, and essentially have accused the Russian side of trying to slow walk the entire thing and making it so that the only outcomes can be this progress on prisoners of war, an exchange of prisoners of war, and issues like that, rather than the bigger picture, which would be a discussion of a full ceasefire.
And indeed, the Russian media, Russian state media, published what it said were Russia's proposals, and among them a demand for Kyiv to withdraw from Kherson, Zaporizhia and Donbass. These are regions that Moscow doesn't actually completely control, but it claims historically, and also a limit on Ukraine's armed forces. And the moment you see this list, you know that this is going to go nowhere.
Right, and also that what the Ukrainians have said is that the negotiators discussed by Moscow don't actually have negotiating power, that they're just really a letterbox for the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin specifically. That Putin's choice to send Vladimir Medinsky as the head of the Russian negotiating delegation is a sign, Medinsky is a Putin aide, someone who has apparently written things or said things in the past implying that he doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist as an independent country, so he is an ideologue. But ultimately the negotiating team that's been sent from Moscow doesn't necessarily have the power to make adjustments in the room, that it's not really a negotiation. They're just bringing messages from the Kremlin with an idea of dragging these negotiations out, making some small concessions in the form of these prisoner of war exchanges, but ultimately not making substantive changes that could see a real end to the fighting, which is what the Ukrainians say that they want.
And this is what Volodymyr Zelensky has reacted so angrily to in the last 12 hours. He said, I think they're idiots because fundamentally a ceasefire is meant so that there are no dead. He was talking about the fact that the Russians had offered a 2 to 3 day ceasefire to retrieve dead soldiers from the battlefield. And he is expressing extreme frustration here and is now calling for the Americans to step in.
Right, and we saw the calls for the Americans to step in a little bit from the Ukrainian team as soon as they'd left the negotiating room yesterday. That they're really trying to play this card, which is the idea that Zelensky has been saying for a long time that he wants a meeting of the leaders between him and Putin. And we already saw during the negotiations that happened here a few weeks ago that Putin essentially has snubbed him. Zelensky goes to Ankara instead and meets with the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and the negotiators come here and talk. And the Ukrainian side have kept pushing for this meeting between the leaders. They have repeated the idea that nothing is really going to get done until Zelensky and Putin sit in a room together. And because Putin has been very clearly avoiding this, they've now started to say, OK, well, how about a tripartite meeting? Donald Trump has said nothing's going to get done unless he's present there. And unfortunately, he might be right. And so the Ukrainians have said, you're willing to meet with him. How about a tripartite meeting? Why don't we do it this way? And they reiterated that yesterday after the negotiating team left the room, essentially to up the ante and say that, the Russian side is refusing to comply, even with maybe a mediator that might be a little bit more susceptible to Moscow's lines than it was in the past.
Tell us more about the involvement of the location and those around it. And you mentioned the fact there that Vladimir Putin can talk quite easily to Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But what role do the Turks play now?
Well, Turkey has really made a lot out of the fact that this is the place where these negotiations need to happen, that Turkey wants this role as a mediator. And we certainly saw that in the statements from the Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan talking about the idea of this as an opportunity, that the world's eyes are on Istanbul. But also, the irony is not lost in a way in the fact that part of the reason that Turkey is a negotiator is that it has maintained, some form of relationship with both sides, much to the criticism of other parties in NATO. And while these negotiations were happening, there were container ships and oil tankers sailing along the Bosphorus Strait right outside the Tehran Palace, where the negotiations were taking place. Many of those container ships bound for Russia. And this is exactly the kind of thing that the Ukrainians have said. They want to see sanctions on this kind of activity to be stepped up if Russia continues not to comply in a real way with these negotiations.
Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent based out of Istanbul. Thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. 8:10 in Berlin, 7:10 a.m. here in London. Now, Germany's former defence minister Annalena Baerbock has been elected as president of the 80th session of the UN General Assembly. It's a largely ceremonial role, but her appointment has caused anger among the Russians, who accused her of saying that the West was waging a premeditated war against Moscow. Well, joining me in the studio is Chris Chermak, Monocle's senior news editor. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Emma.
Good to have you with us. Just explain to us that Annalena Baerbock's name popped up for a while in politics in Germany, and there are faint echoes of us knowing who she is, or indeed what her role was in Germany. Just recap a little bit about who she is.
Annalena Baerbock was one of the more prominent members of the last German government under Olaf Scholz, and this is a government that will not be remembered by that many people. There were a lot of critical things about this government. Olaf Scholz announcing his Zeitenwende, change in sort of Germany's approach after the war in Ukraine. But Annalena Baerbock singled herself out as a member of the Greens. This was a coalition of the Greens and the Social Democrats. And she was a member of the New Greens, if you will. What was interesting was how much the Greens have shifted under Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck, a former leader as well. They were no longer the sort of anti-war peaceniks of the past that they would have been seen as. They really took on this line of peace through strength, defending the international order and doing what it takes in order to defend that order. And this is where, as you said at the outset, they were extremely critical of Russia supporting whatever it takes to defend Ukraine, help Germany defend Ukraine. They were about the most outspoken people for that. And Annalena Baerbock really made as sort of her ideology as foreign minister that human rights are at the forefront of a foreign policy, and that defending human rights, even through military action, defending the international order, is important. So she had a pretty aggressive foreign policy, and that's what's going to be interesting now, heading into a sort of a diplomatic role. She may have to pivot a little bit from that, because she talked about, Europe having a war with Russia. She called out Xi Jinping of China as a dictator, so she was quite outspoken in her role.
And indeed, as I mentioned, she was defence minister, she was foreign minister. The fact was, though, is that she didn't shy away from ploughing in when it came to to military matters. And this is what annoyed the Russians so much, isn't it? Because when the Russians openly said, "Well, you've just said that the West has declared war against us."
It was absolutely what annoyed the Russians, and why, even when it came to this vote, it was interesting that, for example, yesterday the UN General Assembly voted Annalena Baerbock in as president. It was a secret ballot rather than, as it's traditionally done, by acclamation, where all the nations and their representatives stand. This was, as it's understood, at the request of Russia, that wanted a secret ballot. They were perhaps hoping that they might still be able to stop her election as head of the General Assembly. They didn't succeed in that. 167 countries voted for her out of 193. 7 voted against, 14 abstained. We won't know exactly which countries those were because it was secret. But so it does show that she had a huge amount of support. She was running unopposed for this position. And on the one hand, you did have countries like Russia and its allies, Belarus and Serbia, criticizing this because they believe that Annalena Baerbock is partial, rather. But at the same time, you did have other sides who are very supportive of this idea that somebody so prominent, who has just been a foreign minister of Europe's largest economy, wanted a position like this, right? Because that shows that, this is a role that is important and she can bring something to it.
Well, what she brings to it is something that the Ukrainians are incredibly hopeful about, because I think the Ukrainian representative to the UN has said he wants Annalena Baerbock to use her position, which she doesn't stay in for very long, does she? It's a matter. It's just 1 year to bring an end to the war. And the fact is that she does have a moment that she can seize here.
She does have a moment she can seize. She will start in September, so it's important to say there's still a couple of months before this 1 year post begins. This is a ceremonial role, as you said at the outset, in many ways, so she doesn't necessarily have power. But given the connections she has to the ambassadors around the world, given her recent role as a foreign minister, she has connections and she could really play this diplomat, this mediator. It's something that she made clear in her speech to the General Assembly yesterday, saying her tagline was, "We are better together." She wants to bring sort of unity to the United Nations, and particularly she stressed the fact that there are so many conflicts around the world. This runs against the UN Charter, 120 conflicts around the world. This is something that she wants clearly to tackle. Whether she can actually be that mediator, given that, as we've been saying in the past, she was very strident in many of her views. She wasn't necessarily the impartial one. We'll have to see.
And in terms of, she has this moment that she's seizing, but actually when we look to the wider context, she can do what she can in the 12 months that she's got in her ceremonial role, but there are always those wider questions about the relevance of the United Nations and the fact that it can absolutely paralyse itself. Well, it always seems to paralyse itself at moments of most urgency.
So, yes, absolutely. And Annalena Baerbock leaned into this in her speech as well. She talked about the existential challenges that the United Nations is facing right now. One of the interesting things is the fact that she is at the head of the General Assembly, right? You have the Security Council, you have the General Assembly. The Security Council is completely paralyzed at the moment because Russia has veto power. The US has veto power, for that matter, over decisions on Israel. So there's a lot of double standard talk and all this in the Security Council. So this is the moment for the General Assembly, as the representative body of all 193 members, to take some kind of lead. And that's something that Baerbock made a point of as well. She talked about the General Assembly playing a role also in, for example, the next head of the UN Secretary General, which is, of course, the most powerful post, the executive of the UN. Antonio Guterres' term is up, and Annalena Baerbock is going to be crucial in helping to choose who becomes the next leader, Secretary General of the United Nations. And she wants the General Assembly to play a bigger role in that, have a more transparent process, not have it be just the sort of 5 biggest powers in the UN deciding who is going to be the next Secretary General. So she's pushing for a lot more transparency of the United Nations to face up to some of these challenges. And the other important thing to say in terms of the existential crisis that the UN faces is the funding, right? This is a big issue. Donald Trump and the Trump administration have wanted to cut funding to the United Nations. They're leaving the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accords. This is something she is focused on as well. She wants the UN to be more streamlined, reformed in that sense as well, to make its budget slimmer, pushing for efficiency and transparency so that it is fit for this time that we're in.
Finally, we saw Emmanuel Macron head over to the Shangri-La gathering over the weekend, offering an alternative in terms of trade and a new vision, that idea that you don't have to find yourself naturally allied to the United States or to China. Now we have Germany, dare we say, re-emerging onto the international scene with Friedrich Merz. At what point do we actually recognise that there is a more coherent European voice emerging here?
That's a good question. There is, one would hope, a coherent European voice emerging out of Friedrich Merz. Germany, of course, itself is going to take still this more strident line than, say, Annalena Baerbock is. She's going to have to be now the diplomat who says that she is open to all sides. It's also something she talked about in her speech. Her door is always open. She wants diverse views. She's going to listen to all member states. Germany certainly is going to be the one under Friedrich Merz who is leading still when it comes to issues like Ukraine, supporting military support for Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So I think you're going to see a stronger, more strident Germany as well under Friedrich Merz, sort of taking the voice, with also Friedrich Merz and Volodymyr Zelensky having met already 3 times since he came into office. You're going to see Germany trying to take this lead as the voice of Europe. And yes, that for that point, Germany having this position at the helm of the UN General Assembly certainly shows that this is a moment for brand Germany, for its soft power. On the one hand, strengthening its military and being that military voice in Europe, but on the other hand, also being one of the chief diplomats in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Chris Cermak, Monocle's senior news editor. Are you busy with other stuff today? What's on Chris Cermak's to-do list?
Busy with other stuff as well. We'll be working on the briefing later on this afternoon, preparing that show. We'll see what we talk about. We'll probably talk about South Korea to some degree and some of the issues. The Iran nuclear talks as well we'll be talking about on the briefing today.
We'll be talking about South Korea too in just a moment. Chris, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. Still to come on today's programme.
One of the strengths here is the military-civilian relationship. It's strong. You don't see that on a lot of conflicts. Very often you start seeing tension between those two groups.
How Canada's ambassador to Ukraine finds moments of peacefulness in times of conflict. Stay with us on The Globalist.
IQ, EQ, and AI. 3 components key to the craft of innovation at UBS. Because to stay ahead in a rapidly evolving age, you need a partner with decades of experience, endless passion for the work, and a finger on the pulse of leading technologies, bridging human expertise with artificial intelligence, all to elevate you. UBS, banking is our craft.
Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining us from our Zurich studio is Juliet Linley, journalist and broadcaster. Good morning, Juliet. How's Dufourstrasse 90 known? We sort of fondly call it D90, but how's it looking?
Good morning, Emma, from D90. It's looking a bit wet and it's looking a bit sad, but there's so much sunshine inside the studio with our valiant producer, Desiree Bundley.
Which is always an absolute joy to know that we have Desiree Bundley in the building. This thing about Zurich and wet, it's a thing this summer, isn't it? Even we've got more sun than you guys.
It's very worrying. I mean, it's the beginning of June and it really feels like November. What can I say, Emma? I hope that by the time you move here, is that going to be in a couple of weeks? I hope that by then the weather's looking much better.
Plane is booked.
Yeah,
off we go to Zurich next week. Tell us what's in the papers. You're going to have to sort of prepare us as we hunker inside.
Well, let's go to Bern, 1 hour's train journey from Zurich, where you have over 50 former Swiss diplomats are blasting their country for its silence on Israel. So you've got the former Swiss ambassadors to Germany, Iran, the US, former MPs, former special envoys to the Middle East for the Swiss government. They've all signed a letter to the Swiss Foreign Ministry saying they are shocked at Switzerland's silence and passivity regarding what they're calling Israel's war crimes in Gaza. So the signatories are calling on Foreign Minister Ignazio Cassis to implement immediate measures against Israel, including recognizing the state of Palestine, as well as rejecting the plan to expel the civilian population from Gaza and for Israel to reoccupy it. And they're also demanding the immediate release of all Israeli hostages, as well as Palestinian prisoners who are being held without trial. They're calling for a rejection of cooperation with the new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, as well as suspending all academic and scientific cooperation with Israel. So Emma, this is a big story. It's getting a lot of traction in the press because these are heavyweights from the Swiss diplomatic corps. And, you know, the interesting thing about this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was only so recently established in February, only just opened sort of its operations last week, and it's already at the center of so much controversy. Well, it's actually been registered both in Delaware and in Geneva. So there's so much interest in this foundation. There are Swiss authorities that are said to be already investigating its activities, underlining the potential for violations of international law, the use of Swiss territory for operations that are contravening humanitarian standards. Emma, it's a big story.
Indeed. I mean, when you think about the fact that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is run out of Geneva. When you think of that at first, you think, OK, it adheres to the Swiss principles of neutrality and being Geneva being such the global centre of NGOs, charities, and indeed those who wish to do good. But this letter, they really aren't holding back, aren't they? You know, the language that they use, ethnic cleansing, a genocidal process. This firmly plants a Swiss voice on a much less impartial footing.
Yeah, and let's remember this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, it may well be registered in Geneva, but, you know, it's run by armed American security contractors, and it was created specifically as an alternative to the UN's aid channels. As we know, Israel has repeatedly been saying that it was needed in order to stop Hamas stealing aid and diverting humanitarian supplies. Hamas are denying that. So, yes, you hear the name Geneva and you automatically think UN, you think of the Red Cross, you think of the UNHCR, but there is more to this than just the name.
Let us move to the Vatican, your sort of the comfortable patch from which you bring great news. And how's Pope Leo? How's he getting on?
Pope Leo is doing very well. He's very busy. We're seeing a lot of him in the news, these days. And it's clear that he is indicating he's getting down to business on two crucial matters, which are Vatican finances and fighting clergy sex abuse. So to that point, he's been meeting with the Archbishop Giordano Piccinotti, who's in charge of the administration of the Holy See's patrimony. So that's him knuckling down on finances. Remember, the Vatican's pension fund has a shortfall that could reach between $800 million and $1 billion within the coming years. And in addition to pension liabilities, there's a budget deficit of $80+ million. So Leo's got a lot on his hands. He's going to have to slash clergy salaries. He's going to try to ramp up donations. Not easy now. Especially donations have been wilting, if you want, ever since the clergy sex abuse scandals have come to light. And on that front, he's been meeting most recently with the American Cardinal Sean Patrick O'Malley of Boston. And he is in charge of the Vatican's Commission for the Protection of Minors. This was a commission that was set up under Francis. It got a lot of headlines, but towards the end of the pontificate, it was clear that this commission was sort of running aground. It wasn't managing to enact true change. There was a lot of criticism of it. And so at the moment, Pope Leo is going to try to focus on those two things. We hope. These are the signals he's giving out. And even within Switzerland, there have been huge amounts, like 70,000 people rescinding their adherence to the Catholic Church, even in the most recent years, precisely because of sex abuse scandals. And this is a country which has less Catholics than Madagascar, for instance, but it still has 2.8 million Catholics. They could be big donors. Let's see if Leo manages on that front. But he's also been busy in sporting news, Emma. This is also the pontiff whose personal trainer was recently interviewed on Italian television, and we talked about that and how many bench presses he does or doesn't do. So Leo's a big tennis fan, and he met Yannick Sinner when Yannick was here for the Italian Open just recently here in Rome. Actually, Yannick gave him a racket, and he had brought in some tennis balls into the Vatican, and he did say to Leo, we saw this in the Vatican press coverage, let's have a volley or two. And Leo said, oh, no, we would break too many things. So Leo has also met players of Napoli, the team that has won the Italian League Championship last month. And then just day before yesterday, the Pope blessed the 159 cyclists of the Giro d'Italia, calling them an inspiration for youngsters, role models for today's youth in the final stage of the race, which for the first time in history, Emma, passed through Leo's very own backyard, the Vatican Gardens. So popes have blessed cyclists in the Giro before. The race in the past has passed through St. Peter's Square. But this was the first time that the peloton rode inside the Vatican walls on a 3-kilometer route. I have to tell you, though, it was a neutralized, non-competitive part of the Giro d'Italia, but it was still a great opportunity for the athletes. And, you know, Simon Yates, of the UK, who won, he said it was an unforgettable moment, and he actually hadn't realized he'd get to shake hands with the Pope and receive his blessing. And he said it was like so emotional when he realized that was indeed the case.
Not to mention possibly the invite to go and do some bench presses later with the Pontiff. It's well worth looking up that story, isn't it, Juliet?
Indeed.
Juliet, thank you so much for joining us from Dufourstrasse 90. That's Monocle Studio in Zurich. The time here in London is just nudging 7:29 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at some of the other stories we're keeping an eye on today. The UN human rights chief has denounced the new US and Israeli-run aid delivery system in southern Gaza, saying it's heartbreaking and shows utter disregard for civilian life. Volker Turk said civilians were being made to run for aid in desperate circumstances. He also said the UN had raised the issue of ethnic cleansing with Israel. All the administrative staff at the Chiquito banana plant in Panama have left the country, and the firm is to sack its remaining staff. Last week, the company fired 5,000 workers in response to a strike at its banana farms. And Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has defended this weekend's vote to elect the country's judiciary, saying it was a complete success. This is despite a turnout of just 13%. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now for a closer look at some of the other headlines we're following today, here's Monocle's foreign editor Alexis Self with his take on Mongolia's thriving democracy.
Mongolia, an unusually robust democracy surrounded by autocratic states, is in disarray today, with the country's Prime Minister, Oyen Erdern Luv-Zamansrai, expected to call a confidence vote in his own government. The move follows weeks of mounting protests, prompted by social media photos of Oyen Erdern's son's lavish lifestyle that have brought instability to the Central Asian democracy. The country is trying to heave itself up towards developed status while maintaining good relations with both the West and its two behemoths neighbours, Russia and China. Protests began in mid-May when the fiancé of Oyen Erdern's 23-year-old son, Temukleni, posted pictures of luxury handbags and her Mercedes-Benz to her Instagram account. This is not a good look in a country where many live in abject poverty. Whatever the results of this week's confidence vote, Mongolians are desperate to see the country's immense natural resource wealth more fairly apportioned. It's heartening that their democracy is robust enough, especially given their neighbours, that popular protest can move the dial in this way. But they shouldn't need to be out in the streets with placards as often as they are.
And thanks to our foreign editor Alexis Self there. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, just sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. It's 15:32 in Seoul, 7:32 a.m. here in London. Now, South Korea will attempt to turn a political page today as it holds a snap presidential election. It follows the impeachment and removal of the former president Yoon Suk-yeol, who declared martial law last December. One would think that Koreans would opt for a candidate who carries minimal risk, but the frontrunner is currently under Supreme Court review for election law violations. So to tell us more on what lies ahead, I'm joined now by Raphael Rashid, a journalist based in Seoul, author of The Korea We Refuse to See. Good afternoon, Raphael.
Good afternoon or good morning.
Good to have you with us. So voting has begun. What's happening?
Yeah, polling opened this morning at 6 a.m. And the weather's good and the turnout has been quite encouraging. Just as of 30 minutes ago, we've had a turnout of 68.7%. It's a temporary public holiday here to encourage people to go vote. I think the atmosphere is remarkably calm considering the circumstances through which this election is taking place. But overall, I think it's very encouraging and people are very motivated to go out and vote. And the polling stations will close tonight at 8 p.m.
This sounds as if South Korea is doing well to put itself on a positive footing, but it has been a very difficult and painful journey to this point.
Yeah, of course. The irony or the fascinating thing is that it's exactly 6 months to the day today, on December 3rd, that former President Yoon declared martial law and threw the country into absolute chaos. A constitutional crisis ensued. We did see armed military trying to burst into the National Assembly, essentially overthrowing democracy as we know it out of the blue. And it's been a very turbulent time since. Many people want to see a close to this chapter, to the terror, regardless of what side of the political lines they are on. And I think people are seeing this as a kind of turning point. They want to see change. And I guess we'll have to see through this election what people really want.
I mentioned at the beginning of this that the front runner is under Supreme Court review for election law violations. This is Lee Jae-myung. Tell us about them a little bit more, and again how we've got to this point where the person who could assume the presidency already has a shadow cast over.
Yeah, well, so Lee Jae-myung is the front runner at the moment. He's leading the polls by with around 46% maybe. He's around 10 points ahead of his rival Kim Moon-soo of the Conservative People Power Party. But Mr. Lee has been plagued by several legal issues over the past several years. He's been accused of all sorts of different things, and he's had multiple trials going on. And just recently in May, the Supreme Court ordered a retrial of an election law violation case, overturning his acquittal with instruction for conviction. So up until about a month ago, we thought that essentially maybe he might not even be able to run in this election. But out of the blue, courts agreed to postpone hearings after the election. But the big question is, if he wins the election tonight, what happens to these unresolved trials that will continue taking place supposedly after he becomes president? And there are big constitutional questions as to what happens, because of course he would have immunity, but what happens to ongoing trials? We've never been in this kind of situation before. So a lot of uncertainty, and some conservative legal experts say that he could basically be found guilty and the presidency would be removed from him. I mean, we absolutely have no idea what may happen over the coming weeks or months.
Indeed, with all these very sort of dynamic risk assessments going on as they're going into the elections, what lessons are being learned in South Korea here about politics and the democratic system?
I mean, I guess in terms of, I think people are very hopeful in their systems. Of course, it's not a perfect system and it was almost overthrown. But I think through this entire chaos, we have seen the resilience of democracy in this country. And after all, it was Mr. Yoon Suk-yeol who wanted to overthrow these democratic institutions, but ultimately it was these democratic institutions that actually removed him from power. So I think people they're still positive that they can have a little bit of faith in these systems. Of course, when we have these legal troubles against Lee Jae-myung and then the Supreme Court suddenly ordering a retrial one month before the election, people, of course, are a little bit concerned that maybe there might be some electoral interference. That's what some people call it. So it's still uncertain waters, but I would say overall, people are quite positive about the system overall.
Rafael Rashid, journalist based in Seoul, author of The Career We Refuse to See. Thank you so much for joining us on the line. You're with Monocle Radio. Now, Monocle's contributing editor Andrew Muller has been attending the Black Sea Security Forum in Odessa to hear from officials, politicians, businesses and experts about the key security, economic and political challenges facing the Black Sea. Well, during the meeting, he sat down with Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, Natalka Simok, to talk about her presence at the forum. And he began by asking her whether she had second thoughts about taking up the job at a time of war.
I have to admit, actually, that I had said yes right away, and I should have actually checked with my husband first. So I think it's going to be the highlight of my career. So I'm very excited to be here because I'm very passionate about Ukraine. When I was here in 2014, or earlier, about 10 years earlier, I have to admit I was one of those people who worked in the embassy that was like, if I was ambassador, I would do this. If I was ambassador, I would do this. And so now I'm ambassador, and one, I see it's a lot harder than it looks. And two, it's an opportunity for me to lean forward and do what I think is right here.
What did you discover about a job like this that did turn out to be much harder than it looks?
It's the public speaking, and I think that's the current situation. When I had my interview with the minister, she asked me for three things. Are you comfortable with the following three things? So one was public speaking, two was media interviews, and three was social media. I, of course, said yes to all three, but I had to quickly get myself comfortable in all three.
And in making the decision to come to Ukraine, how important was your own family background? Did you feel sort of an obligation to the ancestors?
So, yes, of course. But I have been coming here since the 90s. I fell in love with the country. And I think anybody who comes here and spends time here falls in love with the country, whether they have Ukrainian heritage or not. I know a lot of people in Canada, including family members who have Ukrainian heritage, are not necessarily compelled to come here. So I think it might have been the original reason in the 90s I was intrigued to come here, but what kept me coming back was the sheer belief in Ukraine on it for its own merits.
It must surely seem, much the more so in the last 3 years and last 10 years, a vastly different country to what it was like in the 1990s.
I think some of the trends I would say that are always here is that, as I said on the panel, I think what keeps this country really going and undefeatable are the people. I mean, people just on their own organize themselves. I think that in the first few days we saw that in a full-scale invasion, they organized themselves, right? Before the army could even figure out what they should be doing fully. I mean, of course, I'm not picking on the army because they did fantastic, but without the assistance of those territorial units that are self-organized, I don't know if they would have been able to do what they did. So they needed that civilians. And I think one of the strengths here is the military-civilian relationship. It's strong. You don't see that on a lot of conflicts. Very often you start seeing tension between those two groups. And here, the civilians really trust and rely on the military, but the military understands that it relies entirely on the civilian as well, in terms of humanitarian support, in terms of some of the NGOs that they do. So it's, especially you saw that in the first few months with the delivery of equipment. A lot of equipment was actually delivered to the front line by civilian organizations.
There is, of course, quite a long Canadian investment in modern Ukraine. The last time I was in Ukraine was about 10 years ago to do a story on Operation Unifier, and I spent some time with the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry up near Lviv and Kamenets-Podilsky, training Ukrainian soldiers rotating back out of Donbass, the very early stages of the war. Why was it that Canada was so invested so early? I know there is a big Ukrainian population in Canada. Was it just that, or was there something else going on?
I was there at the time, and I remember we had spent a lot of time making the pitch for it and the support for it. So I think in part, yes, the Ukrainian diaspora has a part to do with it. But I think we as a country really quickly understood that European security relies on the security of Ukraine. And I think that has a lot to do with it as well.
You're an ambassador of an ally to a country at war, which I guess is a very particular sort of being an ambassador. As far as you're able to understand it, how different is your average day, to the extent that you have an average day, from what a Canadian ambassador in Berlin or Paris or Rome or Madrid might be doing today?
Well, I don't have weekends and I don't have evenings, and people keep telling me I need to find that life-work balance. I think that's why we have to leave every 2 months for 10 days, and I think we then do all of our are reading and taking care of ourselves at that point. It's not that I'm not taking care of myself. I do. I make a point of talking to people. I meet with people. That's part of my job as well, but it keeps me sane and it keeps me grounded. But I think me being here, and obviously never to the same extent of what a Ukrainian might feel, but to a greater extent than somebody in Canada would feel. I think by being here, we understand what Ukrainians are facing and doing a little bit better, right? So I don't know any Ukrainian now who doesn't have a family member or a really close friend who hasn't passed away in the war. The sheer numbers of people that have passed here and died on the front is unbelievable. And as I mentioned also on the panel, what really irks me are the people who are taken and kept captive and detained without being charged or on false charges, tortured, including sexual torture. And if that is one of my main causes, that I just want to keep bringing attention to that. Yeah, I don't know what else to say, but I think I'm very passionate about the issues, and I'm very passionate about people and what they're doing. And if I can help find ways that Canada can support it. Canada's a government, but also Canadian organizations. So I see a lot of my job is not just eyes and ears on the ground, but it's use my position, my knowledge to also bring people together. So if there's a Canadian company or a Canadian NGO or an academic institution that should meet this organization here, I will put them in touch. That, I think, is going a little bit beyond my job, but I think this is where you have that value added.
And that was the Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, Natalka Simok, talking to Monocle's contributing editor Andrew Muller in Odessa. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
Each of us has a craft, a calling that inspires us, whether it's how a coffee is brewed, a chair is built, or how money is looked after. There's a love for the work, a care that compels you forward. For us at UBS, it's about designing a unique outcome for you. Because whatever your craft may be, ours is built around helping you succeed. UBS, banking is our craft.
.45 here in London. Let's talk aviation now with Sally Geffen, aviation and travel analyst, commentator, regular voice around here. Good morning, Sally. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good to have you with us. Everybody's been talking about IATA in New Delhi. What are the big headlines coming out of it in the last 24 hours, please?
Yeah, so, IATA's focused on airlines, represents over 200 of the world's largest airlines, not least Emirates, and Sir Tim Clark has been talking about airlines as a whole, not just Emirates, actually reviving or boosting the economy class offering for passengers, saying that it's been neglected for too many years. Well, one could argue that pretty much all low-cost carriers and other airlines do offer a revamped economy. It's just that the brand or the name of economy has changed so much. And also we have various iterations of that now. We have sometimes 4 cabins in a larger airline where you would have economy, premium, and just various degrees of economy to offer more flexibility for passengers.
Indeed. And what are you saying? You mentioned this in at IATA, saying, could we make economy seats more comfortable with more features, functionality and product? He basically said that it's been stuck in the 90s. He said a lot of work was done on economy in the 1990s, but since then the focus has been on premium. In various experiences, it depends on which aircraft you find yourself, clipping yourself into, doesn't it?
On this one, I do disagree with him. I really do, because there are airlines offering just amazing experiences to passengers for what is an economy class price ticket. I'm thinking of Vueling, for example, in Spain. The newer airlines in particular have the opportunity to offer, brand new cabin, brand new seating, which is not on a par with economy class seats in the 1990s at all.
OK. Other headlines coming out of IATA, updates to the financial outlook. How healthy is it?
Well, it is healthy. And so IATA, the way IATA plays this is like it's healthy, but don't get too complacent because so, for example, net profits are at $36 billion, which sounds brilliant, doesn't it? And it's improved from what was $32.4 billion last year. But in actual fact, the way it boils down to actual profit per passenger is just over $7, which is arguably the price of a coffee. So airlines do not want governments to introduce regulation or make life more difficult for them because they find it very hard to turn a profit. Obviously, we were, as an industry, expecting the profitability to increase and passenger numbers to return. We're looking at 4.99 billion passengers, a total number of passengers, 4.99 billion, up 4% on 2024. But it's sort of flattening out a little bit. So it's increasing, but not in the rebound way that it did after the pandemic.
Indeed, we mentioned this yesterday on the briefing on Monocle Radio, when we were talking about the fact that the world's airlines are saying actually trade wars and the associated lack of confidence or consumer confidence is adding pressure on them. But there is one thing about the aviation world, is it is incredibly good at pivoting and being flexible.
Yes, and in fact, it's in a way, it's like an indicator, it's like a weather vane for global economy and business as a whole, because, as you say, very adaptable. We call it cyclical or cyclical is the term that we use for the aviation industry, because it goes in cycles. And unfortunately, there are winners and losers. Many airlines collapse or fold in the face of geopolitical conflicts, collapse of financial markets, for example. We've seen that, but it does always rebound. And that's because despite, concerns about global warming and climate change and the need for sustainability, passengers do want to travel and often have a need for travel as well.
Let's, in that context, talk about the United Kingdom. It announced yesterday that it's going to redesign its airspace in order to accommodate these huge changes in capacity. Tell us more.
Yeah, so the current airspace, you'll be surprised to know probably, is that which was designed in the 1950s just for 200,000 flights a year, whereas now they're handling 2.7 million flights a year. And also UK airspace disproportionately handles more of European traffic than its counterpart navigation service providers in continental Europe as well. Yes, so the plan is to actually bring in this redesigned airspace, not only to handle increasing volumes of passengers, but also a change in the nature of air travel, especially in metropolitan urban areas. So we're talking about electrical vehicle, vertical and takeoff landing vehicles. So flying taxis, as they're more commonly known now, and use of drones in the lower airspace as well. But also to, address that sustainability, reduce carbon emissions by reducing the delays in the air, the nasty holding patterns where you get airplanes circling for large amounts of time when the airspace gets congested over Heathrow or a large airport. So the aim is not only to introduce efficiency, but reduce noise and also cut carbon emissions as well, and handle the new generation of air traffic.
Sally Gethin, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. That was the aviation analyst there. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, live on Monocle Radio. Finally, last year, Japan experienced one of its most extreme heat waves since records began. Almost 2,000 people died as a result of the high temperature. Well, now a law has been passed that obliges employers to protect employees from excessive heat. Well, Fiona Wilson is Monocle's Tokyo bureau chief. She joins us now from our air-conditioned studio in the Japanese capital. Is that correct, Fiona?
It certainly is. Thanks, Emma. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key things to avoid heat stroke is air conditioning. And I think there's a lot of concern that trying to save bills, people might switch off their air conditioning. Absolutely don't do that is the headline.
Now, I gave us a little taster of just how bad things were last year with dozens of people dying. I mean, was it really that an intenser period?
The last 2 summers have been record-breaking, and you just look at the statistics. I mean, last July there were several days over 40 degrees in numerous locations, and just the average summer temperature was 1.7 degrees hotter than usual. And even that's, it seems like a fairly small amount. But yeah, the numbers of people who had heat stroke. I mean, in Japan, you were talking about there were 2,000 people who died of heat stroke. Actually, Tokyo had fewer people, but just the number of people, not just at work, but, people were dying at home. And I think there's particular concern about pensioners, maybe on their own, nobody keeping an eye on them, and maybe they're not keeping as cool as they should.
And so now we have the government stepping in and bringing in legislation which protect workers.
That's right. Well, what they're saying is that if employers don't look after their workers, they're going to be fined. It's quite a substantial fine. They'll get a €3,000 fine, 500,000 yen, or even a 6-month jail term. And what they have to do is make sure they have a policy for when, the way they measure this, they have a sort of heat stress index, and it's called the wet bulb globe temperature. And what it is, it measures a sort of combination of heat, humidity, solar radiation, and they work out this figure. And if it goes above a certain figure, that's when they know that people start to get heat stroke. And, just from a purely practical point of view, if they don't get heat stroke, they're definitely going to be losing capacity for production. So it makes sense to call a halt to proceedings. And if people do get heat stroke, companies now have to have procedures in place. They have to treat them immediately. They have to take them to hospital. I mean, what they've discovered is that early treatment is much better for the outcome of the patient. And, last year there were well over 1,000 people who were off for days on end because they weren't treated properly. And
indeed, this isn't just a national system, is it? We now have the likes of the authorities in Tokyo trying to make the general situation more pleasant.
Yeah, I mean, so what the governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Koike, made an announcement in May saying that the Tokyo government, amazingly really, is going to subsidise water bills this summer. They're very concerned about people trying to, hydration is one of the things, and they don't want people not using their utilities because they're worried about the bills. So the government is going to cover the baseline bill, and the bill, for Tokyo is going to be heading for 40 billion yen. It's huge, but they think that could really help. Some people are saying, well, maybe the electricity bills need to come down too, because air conditioning is key. And it's not just people who are outdoors. Obviously, being outdoors, you've got the sun, you're active, and it's a combination of things, actually, heat stroke. But you can also be in your own home and your body temperature goes up too high. So a lot of the old people, they said 60% of indoor cases, people had no air conditioning on. So that really makes a difference. So I'm glad to report that we're looking after ourselves in the Tokyo office.
Indeed, and very glad to hear it. And also there are alert systems that are going to be placed, aren't they? Because what we've talked about is retrospective measures to punish or to fine those who suffer. But actually just as important is letting people know of trouble ahead.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got the Labour Ministry, the Health, Labour and Welfare Ministry. They're looking after the employees, but you also have the Environment Ministry looking at the general picture. And that heat alert system, heat stroke alert, is they're putting that in. That's already in place, and it runs until nearly the end of October now. And that looks at this measurement we're talking about. And when it hits a certain level, they put out an announcement the day before. It's a combination of the Weather Agency and the Environment Ministry. They put out an alert saying, you need to be cancelling sports events or, any outdoor activities that you were thinking of, and, maybe switch to remote working. And there's also now a special heat alert for that. That's when it's really hot, and it's basically, just stay at home.
Good to hear. Thank you very much indeed. Fiona Wilson, Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief, staying cool. You're listening to The Globalist, and that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Chris Chermak, Tom Webb, Ryuma Takahashi and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu, with editing assistance from Hunter Wang. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.